Hello, everybody out there in Milwaukee and out on the internet listening to our show. This is Wisdom for Life. We're doing a special broadcast. We are all observing our social distancing, so we're trying out something new. Dan and I are each of us logging in and recording on our end, so hopefully this is going to be a great show for you. Today we're going to talk about a distinction that's important in philosophy that you might not think has a big part of your life, but actually is quite important, and it's the difference between real or actual and apparent goods and bad. So let me turn it over just for a second to my co-host, Dan Hayes.
Hey, thank you very much, Greg. It is a lovely day, got a little sunshine going on, and we're all hunkered down in our houses due to the whole coronavirus, and hopefully in this time we realize that maybe some of the things that we thought are good are not actually good, and that will allow you to have the ability to focus more on the things that are actually good.
Yeah, and we can say similarly about things that people consider to be bad, that maybe some of them really are bad, but quite a few of them turn out to be not so bad after all. And philosophy gives us resources for not only deciding these sorts of questions. Is something really good? Does it just appear to be good? Is something bad? Does it just appear to be bad? But it also helps us to prioritize between them. And now, in a time of crisis, we actually do have to do a lot of prioritization, don't we? We have to decide what we're going to give our time to, what we're going to spend money on, who we're going to do things for, who we're going to say, no, maybe not right now, not today, right?
Mm-hmm. So, let's talk about the Aristotelian version of this.
Okay, so Aristotle is a pretty representative figure in relation to this. You could say that his take is kind of similar to that of Plato, so two different schools that also get lumped together. And then there's a lot of early medieval and late medieval and modern philosophers who take up Aristotle's position in this way, even if they're not Aristotelians. And Aristotle tells us that as human beings, we're confronted with a variety of things that are good. And they're good in different ways. So he will distinguish between goodness in terms of, say, the just and its opposite, the unjust, the right and the wrong. But he also talks about something that we might consider more aesthetic. He talks about the beautiful and the ugly, which also can be translated as the noble and the base, or the fair and the foul. And then he talks about pleasure. And unlike some other philosophical positions, Aristotle considers pleasure to be a good. So when we sit in front of the TV and as we've been doing, tune into a show and put our feet up and eat a little snack or something like that, that's pleasant, right? It's not producing justice in the world or doing something inherently beautiful or noble, but it's pleasant, and that's also good. And pain or suffering, Aristotle views as bad, and so there's different modalities, and then we can talk about different big basic objects. And when I talk to students about this in classes, we're usually looking at Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, where he talks about different kinds of life and happiness. And we ask, well, what are the components of the good life? What matters to you? That's another way of putting it to these students. And usually they'll say things like, I value my family, or I value my friends, or having a good career. And then we start peeling things back a little bit. And we say, okay, that's fine. Those are the stock answers. What else matters to you? And some of them will come straight out and say, I want to be rich. I need to have money, either to be able to buy all the things that I want, or a sense of security, or it could be a status symbol. And once they start talking about status, then we can start talking about what the Greeks called honor. And that's something people want as well, right? And these are all goods for Aristotle, but they're not the good. They're not what's most good.
But
you're going to say something, right?
Yeah, isn't this the one of the arguments against Aristotle's argument of the good, in that he requires or is expecting that to have the good life, you have to have certain goods like friends for good conversation and a little bit of money, so you can have like at least a modicum of pleasure in one's life. And for a lot of people, those things may not ever be afforded to them.
Well, that's not really an argument against Aristotle's position. That would be sort of realizing the implication that for many people, the Aristotelian good life might not be realizable. But that doesn't mean that we can't have a semi-good Aristotelian life or anything like that, right?
Sure.
A lot of times we're these moral theories, we don't say, well, everybody's going to be reaching the pinnacle of it. They can still provide us guidance. So Aristotle, he doesn't say that somebody. Let's talk about what he considers to be really good. He calls it virtuous activity. So that's kind of old-fashioned sounding. But when we talk about meaningful or moral activity, something where you're doing good in the world and it's flowing from the kind of person that you've become, that for Aristotle is what's most satisfying, and it's also most pleasant too. So the virtues are things like justice or courage or temperance or even good humor, according to Aristotle, being able to laugh with people but not give offense to them in the process, not cause them undue pain. So being able to do these things, which could fit in very well with our careers or could fit in very well with taking care of a person, you're right in a sense that Aristotle thought that it was going to be mostly the upper and middle classes who would enjoy this in the Greece of his time. But contemporary Aristotelians say that this is something that is possible for, if not necessarily all people, at least most people, even outside of the developed world in the third world. Mm-hmm. Because for Aristotle, the core of what's good is, at least if we're looking at the active life, it's developing and exercising these virtues, these traits of character that are stable, that are chosen, that are good for us and good for other people. And then the other stuff, you can think of it as sort of like the icing on the cake. You still have cake even if you don't have icing. But it's good to have people, relationships, friends, family, colleagues that you can engage with. It's good to have some means so that you're not stuck living on the streets mm-hmm. or in dire straits. And those are the components of happiness. But to go back to the issue of the good, Aristotle thinks that all of these things are good. Mm-hmm. They're just not all as good as each other. Mm-hmm. And so if we...
So,
go ahead.
To your point, you're talking about like moral virtue. You're talking about Hexas for that action, correct?
Yeah, and so we should say what that means.
Mm-hmm.
So Hexas is a Greek term, and it comes from the word to have. And so what we've got in that, it often gets translated as habit, but it's a little bit stronger than just a habit.
Is it not an action chosen knowingly for its own sake?
Well, it produces those.
Mm-hmm.
But a hexas is actually the disposition that produces those. So if you let's take some concrete examples. Let's take courage, because that's really applicable right now. There's a lot of people who are engaging in actions right now that are courageous, and there's a lot of people that are engaging in actions that are cowardly or, on the other extreme, rash or foolhardy. Right. So the people
paper.
Who say, well, okay, I was going to talk about the spring break thing first and Corona parties, but yeah, let's talk about toilet paper. So hoarding behavior is arguably a cowardly act.
That's an unjust act.
It's also an unjust act. That's right, and it might also be vicious in other ways too. But if you think about the inability to deal with one's own fear, anxiety in a time of uncertainty, and this acquisitive drive to accumulate as much of this product as possible. And it is unjust because it deprives other people of the opportunity to have what they need in the process. Now, you could say, is this a real sign of the person's character? It could be, because some people actually are cowardly in that way. They are. It's become part of their character, right? Other people sometimes just fail, and Aristotle calls this lack of self-control, or in Greek, akrasia. It's often translated as incontinence, which is kind of ironic in terms of toilet paper, right? Because we understand incontinence in a very narrow way. The people who translated Aristotle, in a couple centuries ago, understood it as like giving in to your desires or fears or other things that are driving you, when reason would tell you, no, you don't need to do this. And so, yeah, hoarding toilet paper is an example of cowardly action. It's not courageous, and some people might spin it that way. Oh, I'm saving my family by getting myself 256 rolls. Nah, I don't think so. Or some people, like the guy who was essentially profiteering. He filled up an entire storage locker.
Yeah.
With
the hand sanitizer.
Yeah, but also I think toilet paper, right?
Sure.
Okay, yeah. So any of these goods, right?
Yeah.
He might tell himself, "Oh, I'm being courageous. I'm being bold. I'm being an entrepreneur by cornering the market." But it's really a cowardly act, right? And then on the other side, the people who are unwilling to take any precautions, and maybe even are like showing us how.
Cavalier.
How unafraid they are. Yeah, having Corona parties or things like that. That's not courage. That is foolhardiness.
Absolutely.
So those that's a concrete example, I think, that can help us understand it. And you can also ask about motivation. What would motivate somebody to say, I'm gonna go on spring break anyway? Well, they came out and said it. We paid for it already. So money is more important than behaving in a prudent way for them, and they've done a prioritization between two different goods. Money is a good, losing money is a bad thing, but it's not as important in the grand scheme of things than keeping people safe and remaining healthy yourself. So that's how an Aristotelian would look at these sorts of things.
I feel like we could move to another Hellenistic school. We have the Stoics and their dichotomy of what things are good and what things are not good. And so the major basis the Stoics define as what is good is those things that are within your complete control. And so those are your actions and your aversions and your desires. And everything else falls into a category of indifference.
Sort of. The bad falls within the sphere of your control too, though.
Oh, absolutely.
So it's almost as if you've got like two extremes, right? That come together in the middle. What's in our control that's good, what's in our control that's bad, and then everything else for them is, strictly speaking, indifferent. Although they do, and we'll talk about this in a bit, they do distinguish between preferred and rejected indifference, which confuses people when they hear that.
But I like the idea that there's, say, two sets of things that you might consider good. And say you have a daughter, and say you have the ability to get some ice cream. Would you ever trade your daughter for any amount of ice cream? Versus,
well, I hope not.
I hope not. And the vast majority of us will say, no, there's no amount of ice cream that we will ever trade our daughter
substitute,
for.
Yeah.
Whereas if you have money's in the same level of good, idea of good, and you definitely trade money for ice cream. That's not a problem. But you automatically go into this cognitive. You have to make this moral decision about trading something that is of absolutely different value for something that is not. And so this is a two-tiered level of what is potential goods. And so the goods are the things in Stoic are those things that are under your control, as well as all the things that are bad, and everything are like dependent upon the choices. So money, in this case, as a preferred indifferent, can be used for either good or bad ends, and so in and of itself, it is not good or bad. It is how you use it.
Yeah, that's right. And we can say that from the Stoic perspective, there's a whole bunch of things that fit in there. And this is where I think they, at least at first, they might lose a lot of people. Because the Stoics, a lot of us can say, money, that's not that important. But the Stoics also say that about health and illness.
Right.
And about other good, they say they're not actually rightly called goods, but things that ordinary people would call goods of the body, like attractiveness or strength or
reputation.
Yeah, reputation, social status, whether or not you get promoted or not. All of those things they would say are strictly speaking indifference, and so they don't have they're not rightly called good or bad, and where we make ourselves miserable in a lot of cases is by calling them good or bad, and then when we do that we pursue those things or we avoid them. So if I think that getting sick is a really bad thing, then I will do whatever I can to avoid that. And, this isn't to say that a Stoic would be cavalier about our bodies and say, I'm just going to go out there and forget social distancing and I'm not going to wash my hands or anything like that. That would be imprudent, right?
Absolutely.
But they would tell us that in this time of crisis, we really should be placing the focus on what's most properly ours, whether or not we're good or bad people, and the actions that stem from that. So they line up with the Aristotelians in that respect, right?
Yeah.
Virtue is a good thing, vice is a bad thing, but where they differ is saying, strictly speaking, those are the only good or bad things, and everything else is in this middle category. Like you said, it's a two-tier system, so that whatever value, and things do have values, whatever value you get from pleasure or wealth or reputation, no amount of it heaped up will ever make you a good person. And the goodness of virtue, it outweighs all of those things, and the badness of vice. So no amount of being, well-equipped, having as much pleasure as possible, all sorts of social connections, none of that will ever make up for being a bad person and doing bad things.
No amount of toilet paper or hand sanitizer will make you a good person if you got them in bad ways.
Yeah, now we should talk about what the Stoics call use, or dealing with things, dealing with indifference, because this is where it starts to become, I think, if people were lost before that and they're like, yeah, I'm not going to buy into that. Now they can say, oh, okay, I can kind of get behind this. So while indifference themselves are neither good nor bad, and they're strictly speaking not really in our control, although we can, influence them to some degree, mm-hmm. We don't control the outcomes. How we use all these things, the Stoics are really clear, that is in our control.
Absolutely.
And that is good or bad. So whether, let's say you just happen to find yourself with a stash of toilet paper because your relative who lives in your house did panic buy and ordered a whole bunch of it, and you've got 150 rolls, which I think a lot of people would consider to be vast wealth at this time. Who knows?
Are you smog sitting upon a tower of white gold there?
Yeah, exactly. So let's say you had that, right? Now, that by itself is neither good nor bad, but what you do with it really matters. Do you continue to hoard it? Are you like a dragon, rolling around in its hoard?
It's so soft and comfy.
Exactly.
It's charming.
Looking at it, and marveling at how well equipped you are, or do you do things like see whether your neighbors are in need and go to them and maybe you give them a roll once in a while. You don't just give away the whole stash. Now, doing that would be how you exercise these virtues like justice or prudence, practical wisdom. And so
let's go to justice there. So we have the justice goes down to the actions and how we should be treating others. And And so if I have a glut and I know my neighbors around me are in dire need of either a bidet or some toilet paper, then it would be just for me as a neighbor to give them something that I have a glut of and they are absolutely bereft of.
Deprived of. Yeah. I think that's completely right. And, we could add to this. I think a lot of people, I don't know what it's like where you are, but we live in an apartment building and we know some of our neighbors and we don't know the rest. And now we're probably not going to be like going door to door and knocking and saying, is there anything you need? And we frankly don't have, enough stuff to do that with anyway. But let's say we did. Is there anything like a duty to not just, wait passively for one of your neighbors to need help, but to go out and see who does need help? Is that part of justice? What do you think?
I guess it depends upon your means. And also, like, for example, I have a friend who is circulating a letter in his part of the neighborhood saying, like, he's young and virile and has transportation and will go out and acquire things if people need to go to the store for them or something along those lines. And so like me or him going out of the store is significantly less dangerous than someone that is elderly and potentially immunocompromised. And so
Yes.
I feel like there is a greater requirement depending on the greater difference in what your neighbors need versus what you can provide. And so it's not like I should just be giving up everything and all my time for anyone who asks it, but definitely there are certain people that are in the greatest need, and I feel that we have a obligation to support them.
Yeah, I think that makes really good sense. And that's where a distinction that we make in moral philosophy can be quite helpful. Not everybody buys into this distinction, but sometimes we talk about perfect and imperfect duties. A perfect duty would be one, or a strict duty, and then there's a variety of words where we can call them meritorious or supererogatory. And the basic idea is this: there's some things where we have a moral duty to act, either to do something or not to do something, to prevent something, to promote something, and we have it at that time, and there's no exception to it. So if I see you fall down a well, I shouldn't say, well, I do have a duty to help people when they're in a well, but not in this case. I'll make an exception for this. I need to act on that particular situation. Or if you need to get to the hospital, let's say you've been injured in some terrible way, I could say, well, there's a lot of people who need to go to the hospital. Maybe I'll find another one instead of Dan. No, that's not. I have a strict duty, right? And there's a lot of strict duties that way. And then we have others where we get to decide where we want to devote our resources. I think you're right. We do have a duty to be, as people would call it, being kind or beneficent or generous to others. Even more so, I would say, in a crisis. But it doesn't say that we have to do that for every single person all the time. And I think there's a danger for quite a few people of something like they could go through all their resources, which is a problem for them. But also we do this psychologically, and people get burned out. This feeling that we have to be there for everybody all of the time. It might be enough that we just do some good rather than trying to do all the good, right?
Right. If you become burned out, then you are no longer a good to yourself or anyone else. And so you need to have at least something reserved for yourself in order to keep on going.
That's true. And it's interesting. I was talking with my students about this before in ethics classes when we would get to certain parts of the content. Is there a duty to self-care? Do we have a moral obligation to take care of ourselves? Not in a sort of selfish way where we're like, yeah, I'm gonna buy up all of the luxury skin products because that's my self-care, and forget about the poor or anything like that. No, but like basic self-maintenance and care getting enough sleep, making sure to, engage in personal hygiene, saying no to certain expectations or requirements or obligations when we're at the risk of being burnt out. All of those things I think would fit in with that self-care. But going back to talking about the good, so we've brought up two different schools, right? The Stoics and the Aristotelians. And there is a big difference between them in that the Stoics would say, hey, you Aristotelians, a lot of the things that you call good aren't really good, and a lot of the things you call bad aren't really bad. They're actually indifference. Now, some people said that this is just a verbal argument because the Stoics still end up behaving like, with this preferred and rejected indifference. They're doing the same thing as anybody else, whether it's Aristotle or Aquinas or Augustine or Plato. It's really just a terminological difference. I've never bought that. I think the Stoics and the Aristotelians really are on different pages when it comes to that. What do you think?
I do agree in that regard. Even though, so this is kind of the idea of a performative ethics, and that from different ethical backgrounds you can come to similar ethical outcomes. But I do think, especially with the idea that the Aristotelians still value pleasure, at least modicums of pleasure, as the good, then there are people that are fundamentally unable to acquire that, especially if you think of like people that are in horrible prisons or in slavery, of that sort of thing. It becomes very difficult to ever reach a life of flourishing.
Well, Aristotle doesn't say that pleasure is part of the life of flourishing. He says that virtuous activity is the core component to that, and that you will have some pleasure in doing that, and then having friends or relationships and some small amount of means as well. He in saying that pleasure is a good, he's not saying that it has to be there in the best life. But I think you and I we're sort of emphasizing different things here. Your concern is more, can everybody have this? Mine is less, are these fundamentally different perspectives just in what they define as good or bad,
So could you clarify that statement?
Well, I'm less concerned about whether everybody could enjoy the best life or anything like that, in terms of whether an ethics is a viable ethics or not. It could be that Aristotle, or let's say we pick somebody else, and we're not going to use Aristotle. We're going to call him Professor X. Professor X comes by and says, human happiness consists in just one thing, and that one thing is only available to the most absolutely developed and possessed of resources people. So only, a tiny fragment of the population will ever enjoy it ever in the history of mankind. So, you'd be saying, well, he's got to be wrong because, happiness has to be enjoyed by more people than just a few. But what if he actually was right? If he was right, which is all I'm really worried about, then that would be a bad implication. We'd all be in a terrible situation where none of us can really be happy, but he'd still be right.
Correct.
And so I don't think that whether happiness can be enjoyed by everybody is the index of whether a moral theory is correct or not. I think I can agree in some sense and say, look, if it's something like Professor X, that's so crazy, that can't possibly be the case. Because if it is, we're all totally, out to sea. But the fact that some people, let's think about Plato. Plato places the good similarly in the development of virtue, but it's also in the possession of wisdom, and not everybody can afford a life in which they are going to be devoting themselves to that. That doesn't mean that Plato's automatically wrong because of that.
No.
It's interesting because people make similar arguments against the Stoics. The way of life you're choosing is so hard. Who could ever do that? You say the sage only comes around every 500 years, so the perfect Stoic is very rare. And you can easily respond to them and say, well, we're not saying we're trying to be the perfect Stoic. We're just trying to make our lives incrementally better, and we're looking for some guidance on what we should choose and what we should reject and how we ought to think about things and, whether it's going to help us along on the way. And I'll shut up in a second, let you say some stuff because I can see you thinking about things. So the Stoic way of doing that is one blueprint, right? Mm-hmm. And that blueprint includes some ideas about what's good and what's bad. And the Aristotelian way of looking at it is another blueprint. And they overlap to some degree, and then they're different in some degree. So you almost got to pick which one you're going to follow. Or you can say, well, maybe both of them are wrong.
Could be. And maybe the best answer is I don't know. And hold off judgment there. But I wanted to get to the distinction of not who can expect to actually achieve these goals, but the difference that you were trying to enumerate between the Stoic view and the Aristotelian view, that the Aristotelian has a grab bag of values, and I guess that's the question I wanted to answer.
Yeah, except it's not a grab bag. That's actually a great way to start thinking about it, because I think, and I see this again, when my students first start encountering it, they write papers on Aristotle and they're like, well, Aristotle thinks that the happy life and the good is just all these different things. Then they list a whole bunch of stuff. Mm-hmm. And there's no ordering to it. There's no arrangement to it. There's no, you could say, hierarchization or prioritization within it. For Aristotle, in saying that all of these things are good doesn't mean that they're all on the same level. It means that there's a recognition that there's something positive there. So when I have a snack and I like to take chocolate chips and I dip my spoon in peanut butter and then I stick it in the chocolate chips and I pop that in my mouth and I chew on it and I get effectively the same thing that a Reese's peanut butter cup would be, only much cheaper. And I can, have as much of it as I want or as little of it as I want.
Big old dopamine
pleasure.
Spike.
Yeah, exactly. So that's pleasant, and that is good. And it's good for, it's not just good in one way. It's good in that I like the taste of it, and it makes me, we won't say happy in any sort of full sense, but it makes me happy a little bit. And you're right. There's physical correlates to it, right? And we can say similar things too about when we finish recording this, we have a sense of accomplishment, and that's better than at least it should be better. If I'm properly ordered and organized, that should be better in terms of the amount of goodness or the kind of goodness, the quality of it, than just popping the chocolate and peanut butter in my mouth, And so Aristotle sets up, and I think most people who organize their life fairly rationally, they do this. They say some things are more important than others. It doesn't mean that the other thing isn't good, but it's just not as good. Mm-hmm. Although some of them could be apparent goods. Think about think about hard drugs.
Oh, yeah.
Heroin, not really a good thing, intensely pleasurable for people, but it ruins people's lives. Mm-hmm. Aristotle, I use this again as an example. Aristotle thinks you can have a right amount of drinking, and it's not conducive to health, of course, but it could be good for other things. There is no virtuous mean of taking heroin.
Right.
There's no right amount to take. It's always going to be bad for you.
And if you want to go to alcohol, I guess for certain people who are alcoholics, at that point in time, no amount of alcohol is going to be good for you.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's always, so this goes back to our theme, the real good versus the apparent good. Mm-hmm. So many of the things that we do in life where we make bad or also hasty decisions it's because we're taking things that are only apparent goods as being genuine goods,
So this
or apparent bads as genuine bads.
kind of brings me to the idea of the hedonic cycle, and so
Oh, okay.
a lot of
You
times,
got to explain that for
yeah,
our listeners.
absolutely. I'm going to explain it right now. So the hedonic cycle is the idea that a lot of times we are questing to gain something. So say that new promotion at work, or that new car, or that whatever, that new dress, any physical tangible object, and you get it, and you get that little dopamine spike. But shortly thereafter, that object isn't going to continue to give you that dopamine spike, and you reset back to a standard level of happiness.
Yeah.
And this actually works both ways. And so you look at people who become like double to quadruple amputees, and at first they're like in a really bad state, but over time they come back to kind of a relative mean happiness. And you can see this also really distinctly in Viktor Frankl's work, Man's Search for Meaning, where he describes this from his experience in the concentration camps in Germany during World War II, and how he could see that people, even in this abjectly bad experience, were relatively happy to what they were even before this, and it kind of depends on one's view and state of mind. And so the idea is to try to not be totally influenced on those things that will only give you momentary happiness.
Yeah, not take them as if they're going to be reliable, continual providers, you might say, right? Or, if we want to put it in like business terms, good earners. Now, it's interesting. As you were talking about that, I was thinking, one of the examples is people want to buy a new video game, right? Mm-hmm. And they're like, oh, this is going to be great. And they line up around the block to get it. Or, people do this with technology stuff, like Apple products. You see them.
Got to get that iPhone.
Out. Yeah, exactly. And it's not going to be any different if you get it being the first person or 20th person in line, or whether you get it a week later. It's still the same basic piece of technology. But, a really well-designed game is going to provide more of that over time than a poorly designed, let's just get it out there to make a quick buck kind of game, right? And this is why people gravitate to that. We could say that about literature too, right? If you're reading cheap, let's knock out 1,000 words real quick about this romance stuff. Yeah, or we could talk about media stuff too. A lot of the news that we consume is just garbage.
Right.
And a lot of the times it's people like just chattering about the same stuff, or you turn on the radio and they're like, "Well, we don't know what the story is, but we'll update you as soon as possible." And you're like, that's the same as an hour ago. So there's things that will provide us with rich engagement. And a lot of that is going to be satisfying for us, pleasurable for us. And so, if we think about going back now to virtue ethics, what it means to have a virtue when it's become part of who you are is like that. It's something that you respond to situations in a very flexible way, but in a consistent way. And so you do justice, or you do courage, or you do generosity, and you can rely on that continually happening. And it's a way of like being involved in reality as an agent, but also experiencing reality. That is quite satisfying. And I think that can, that might be one way off the hedonic treadmill, cultivating things like that. Whereas, buying the next consumer product, or, going back to our old example, being able to look at your massive mountain of toilet paper in the pantry, or wherever you've put it, out in the garage, and piled up on your bed because it's the most important thing in your life. That's not gonna help you very long, right?
Right. And so I wanted a quick touch on kind of a Buddhist topic of emptiness. And so this is an idea that we are the ones that are defining what things are in like good or bad terms. And so, we hear the traffic outside our window, and you might consider that to be annoying, or like the neighborhood kids yelling and screaming outside the window, and we're the ones that are defining that is a good or a bad thing. And in and of itself, all it is in this case sound waves, and we are perceiving these sound waves within our consciousness. And if you stop from the point where you are assigning that sound wave to a object, and then also assigning that sound wave to, or that object to a good or bad judgment, if you just
Yeah.
look at it as something that appears in consciousness, it allows you to take back and walk back and realize the very basics of the only thing that is at this point is a sound in consciousness. And you have the ability, because it is only resides within your consciousness, to decide for yourself if you want to consider that a good or a bad thing.
Yeah, and what that points to is our agency, and that we have a responsibility. And this is something we've talked about before. I think a lot of people view themselves as just sort of the prey of their emotions, or their seemingly natural but actually habitual responses to things, labeling them, classifying them, and then almost like automatically, after the judgment is made, reacting to them.
Mm-hmm.
And a main part of the whole idea behind weaning yourself away, and this isn't the way Buddhists put it, but I think it's actually consistent with Buddhism, weaning yourself away from suffering that you're undergoing,
Mm-hmm.
that you don't have to be, is realizing that the problem isn't out there by itself. The problem is you making it a problem. And that's very similar to, Stoicism. And interestingly, I think that although Aristotelians haven't really stressed this that much, there's plenty of resources there in Aristotle for talking about things in such a way, as to do that. I think it's something inherent in a lot of wisdom traditions and a lot of virtue ethics, this realization of our role in things.
All right. So we have a question that we could talk about. We've stole it from Reddit here, and from user Ash640. After being quarantined, has anyone discovered that they have actually been an introvert this whole time? Any thoughts on that, Greg?
That's a big open question, and we'll have to do a little bit of work to make it connect up with this topic of what's really good, what's really bad. So if somebody's an introvert, that means that they enjoy being by themselves, and, correlatively, they're not super happy about being thrown into situations where they are stuck in the churn with other people bouncing ideas and energy off of them all day long, right? They'd prefer, sometimes there can be very high functioning introverts, mm-hmm. where they are good at networking and leading meetings and all that sort of stuff, but it takes a toll on them and they need to withdraw. And I think you're more introverted than I am. I'm not a pure extrovert in that I really need that sort of interaction. The way some people, if they're not getting it, being quarantined is awful for them, right? But while I like it, I can also be on my own, so I'm kind of like in the middle. But I think you're more introverted, right? Mm-hmm. So talk about that a little bit.
So yeah, I find I'm actually very good in social settings and have the ability to have small talk or deep conversations with small to large groups. I lead large groups on a weekly to multi-weekly basis. But it is still after I've done that for a couple hours, is incredibly draining. I need to withdraw myself in order to regain that stamina. But I think in regards to this question, it's interesting because this whole situation is allowing a lot of people to, because we are being forced into a certain amount of isolation, it also is kind of forcing a certain amount of introspection by the individuals. And a lot of times we're just in this rat race, and you got to do that thing, and you do the next thing, and you've got a plan, and maybe someone else has defined the plan for you, and all of a sudden that plan has been thrown asunder, and now we have the ability to reassess these things going forward.
Yeah, that's a good point. Although there's quite a few people who are, you might say, subject to other people's plans. Like, they're being told you still got to show up to work, and now they got to figure out how that's going to happen and who's going to watch their kids, and how they're going to make sure that they stay healthy. But you're right. There's a lot of people right now who have a lot of time on their hands, and they can. It's kind of fortunate that we live in the world of technology that we have now, especially mobile technology. So it's so easy to stay in touch for so many people. But it's still not quite the same. And, I suppose I just thought of this now. If you didn't want to have contact with people while they're reaching out to you electronically, you could just say, well, I'm not feeling good today. How would they know?
Right.
Or you could say, my internet is being overtaxed by all the other people in the neighborhood who are using it. So my bandwidth is really not working well right now. So people could use that, I suppose, as an excuse to get themselves some free space if they wanted it. Coming back to this notion of what's good and what's bad, one way we could look at the introvert, extrovert, do we talk about it as a spectrum or
I'd say
like
a spectrum is better than a binary there.
Yeah. So maybe what it means to be extroverted is valuing as good human interaction much more for its own sake than introverts do, and also not viewing like what do we want to call it, like the pressure of having to be involved with other people or being bombarded by their ideas and stuff, not viewing that as something that is bad and not being averse to it. Whereas the introvert would perhaps be more susceptible to that, and might also value solitude or being on their own as something that's actually good, whereas the extrovert perhaps doesn't do that.
I guess I push back against that definition a little bit because, as more introverted than extrovert, I don't think that interaction is a bad thing, and I value both. I just know that one is more taxing on me than the other.
Yeah, I'm not saying interaction per se would be the bad thing. It would be the sort of being bombarded, having to go beyond a certain level. A good catchphrase for this. Think about this is a meeting that could have been an email. Mm-hmm. You've heard that one before, right?
Right.
Okay, so people were saying that before all of this crisis stuff, and there have been many meetings that probably should have been an email. Extroverts are perfectly fine with that,
right?
Because they love showing up to meetings. Introverts, they realize, what the hell am I doing here? Why am I wasting time with all this chit chat and the minutes? We could have done this through some other thing too. It doesn't have to be an email. It could be like meeting virtually. So it wouldn't be the meeting per se. It would be something about the meeting, exceeding certain thresholds, we might say, of unnecessariness that the introvert has an objection to more than the extrovert does. I don't. Does that work, or are there flaws with that as well, you think?
To a certain extent, like I worked in tech, and so those tend to be more introverted people, and so the meetings tend to be very short. And
oh man, you should be in academia.
Oh God. How about I shouldn't be in academia?
Yeah, I'm just saying you should be, so that you could experience what academic meetings are like. This is total digression, but I'll say it, and it's not all that nice. But so before I actually worked on campus, I taught in prisons, and so I didn't have to go to faculty meetings. And then I started teaching just in a regular position, and I'd have to go to faculty meetings. And I'd heard all my colleagues, at conferences, oh, they're so terrible, and I thought, oh, they must be like taking the wrong viewpoint on it or something like that. And then I started going to faculty meetings, and there's something weird that happens. You have all these really smart people, and usually you'd think, well, you put a whole bunch of smart people together, now we've got like a super group. No, something happens in so many meetings where it's almost like the intelligence level of everybody drops in the meeting setting, and things have to be repeated and they take way longer to work out and people misunderstand things, or you're like, how did you misunderstand that? And I don't know if that's just endemic to academics.
I wonder if there's like going back to our good and bad or true goods, that like the good of trying to get the right outcome is butted up against the good of trying to look good in a social sense, and so even though someone might have the wrong opinion about the first topic, they're trying to push their social capital up, and so they're going for one good at the fault of the other, or at the detriment to the other.
Yeah, that kind of makes sense. Actually, that would be an interesting thing to explore in some future show. What is actually happening in meetings?
Yeah,
we could. It might actually be a very helpful topic to explore.
Yeah, and just the idea of what is the point of the meeting? If we can all agree the point is to get the best outcome, then maybe that helps put people in the right state of mind to not be pushing their pet projects.
There's getting people to agree to that sort of on paper or verbally, and then there's actually getting buy-in from them, where they'd set aside their own agenda, and I think that's a lot harder to achieve much of the time, right? Yeah. And sometimes they may actually think that they're furthering the fundamental good of the meeting, but they're not really doing so because they've identified it so much with their own hobby horse that they're going to ride into the sunset. So we should get to talking about
our practice.
For the week. So do you want to introduce it?
So yeah, our practice this week is pause when you have an impression of the bad. And so the idea is when you perceive something that you have automatically been presented to your mind or your consciousness as bad, take a moment and look at it and see, is this actually bad, or is this just my perception of it as bad?
Yeah, now this is something that we do see in a lot of different spiritual and philosophical traditions. The Stoics made a big deal out of this. Epictetus actually says, with every harsh impression, take a pause, ask yourself, is this what it presents itself as being? Impression, but we're going to talk about the meaning of that term. It could also be appearance or imagination. Buddhism has a whole set of practices to engage these sorts of things. Later, Aristotelians and Platonists do as well. You can find this running throughout, medieval philosophy, and I think this is a very commonly discussed practice, but not a very commonly practiced practice,
right?
And so it can be very helpful for us, right? So when now, it's not to say that something is just in our heads, because there are some things that are actually bad that could happen, but if we take a pause, we can distinguish between whether they just appear to be bad or whether they really are bad. And so appearance in Greek is phantasia, and we use that also to translate impression. It's also the word we get fantasy from, which originally means something like imagination. So a lot of the time, when we encounter something and we think that it's bad, we make a judgment about it, maybe without even really thinking it through. We could have implanted a lot in the situation through our own imagining about it. And sometimes we don't even have to be in the situation. We can just bring it up in our minds, and we're already, off to the races, proverbially, imagining how bad this thing is going to be. So let's take a silly example. What if you ran out of toilet paper?
Well, at first I'm like, oh no, what I do? But then I take a step back. I was like, okay, what are the other options that I have to deal with this? Maybe a warm rag with some soapy water would be.
Is this really the end of the world? What did people do before this modern invention existed?
Right?
And we could take all sorts of other things. You start. Here's another great example. You start having a dry cough, and you feel kind of feverish.
It's absolutely achy. COVID-19. It's the thing. I feel bad.
Yeah. So you can take a pause, and it might turn out to be that the bad thing that you think is presenting itself, really is presenting itself, and it really is bad. But you can reduce your anxiety considerably and also reduce your sort of panic reactions, which might not manifest as panic, but might manifest in terms of other emotions like anger and irritation with those around you, or sadness, or morosity, or pick whatever else you want. There's a lot of negative emotions that we experience. You can sort of head those off at the pass because our emotions to some degree are up to us, right?
Mm-hmm. And another way to look at this is kind of the illustration of an optical illusion. And you first see an optical illusion, and you are given an impression that, like, maybe it is a square, but then if you walk around it 90 degrees, you look at it and you realize it's a circle or some other oblong, weird shape that only from certain angles does it actually appear as one thing or the other. And so if you look at this the same way as you think of things when you first think of them as bad, take a moment to examine them from different perspectives, and you can realize what they are in themselves and take that ability and that moment to reassess if it's actually bad or just you thinking it's bad.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And I like that idea of optical illusions, because if you think about how we consume media, we're always looking at optical illusions, right? We're looking at these screens, and we have no problem, looking at the screen and realizing that's not little people in there in my phone doing things. But when it comes to emotional matters and perceptions of things as being bad and then responding to them that way, there are quite often a lot of illusions along those lines that we could distance ourselves from and then kind of look around. So this leads to another sort of key question to ask about this. It's one thing to say, okay, try this out, do this when things get tough. How do we get ourselves to be able to do this? What do we need to do? Is this something that we would try to do before we get into bad situations, like practice it, do some drills almost? What do you think?
Absolutely. The only way for you to change the way that you're going to interact with real world examples is if you have a framework in your mind in order to already be able to go, oh, that's at hand, I can grab that. Whereas if you are thrown into situations and you have no practice, then you are it's going to take you significantly longer to try to implement this thing, and it might be already gone. You've already passed that moment where you just accepted that it was bad in the first place and then just gone with it.
That's very good. So, living an intentional life, which is what this show is all about. And that's why we're providing people with these practices and discussions of all these points. It's partly cognitive, right? We get our heads right about how things are. We think things through. That's where the philosophical theories can often be helpful. But it's also practical. We have to engage in this sometimes on a daily basis. And if we do that, then we're ready to put the ideas into action.
So any final thoughts of the program?
Well, I'm hoping that this sounds good and works really well, because I'm looking forward to doing more shows in this format. This seems like a really good way to do it. And I'm happy that we're able to keep contributing to our local community in this way.
Thank you. I think it's going to be a rough ride here for a bit, but if we take some time to assess our situations, I think we could all get through this a little bit better.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And to go back to something we were talking about earlier, it really is important. This is where we get tested about the things that we believe and say in terms of right and wrong and good and bad, and whether we're behaving like good or bad people. And I guess one of the things that I do want to say is, even if we screw up or if we haven't been great people in the past, we also have an opportunity now to start doing things better, doing things more thoughtfully, doing things in ways that do reach out to others, that over time transform who we are as people into better people.
Great. Well, thank you, and goodbye, everyone.